90% of this is going to be mental. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about setup stuff. I've got some slides in the end that are going to be some basic setup stuff, but most of this is going to be like just getting out and doing laps and practicing and kind of understanding the differences between wet and dry and what you need to be doing. And just keeping a few things in mind as you're doing it so that you're not just overwhelming yourself. The first thing about driving in the wet, right? So I will say that 95% of driving in the wet is mental more than physical. Conceptually, you're doing the same thing driving in the wet as you are in the dry. You're pushing to the car's limit of tire grip and using the most grip that's available, and everyone else is doing the same thing, right? The biggest reason that a lot of people don't quote-unquote like driving in the dry, they don't practice and they don't prep for it. So when a wet race comes up, they're just not ready, and so then they go, oh, I don't like driving in the wet. It's really more about just understanding what you need to be doing differently and making some subtle changes to your driving and sometimes making some subtle changes to your car. But there's also just like the ability to be able to adapt to low grip conditions, whether it's a greasy track or a wet track or a track with standing water on it or a really, really hot track that can be slippery because it's really hot. Being able to kind of drive in these sort of conditions is important because especially on longer races or races with dynamic weather, you don't know what the weather is going to be. Okay, so one thing I wanted to throw up here first before we get started is pay attention to changing track conditions. It's something we talk about in the dry often with track temperature and air temperature and kind of track grip, but with the weather and rain, you also need to pay attention to the adjusting differences over time. So I took a screen cap of the upper right side of the kind of like pit garage screen where it shows the little clock with the 10 and 30 minutes. That's basically what the weather prediction looks like it's going to be over a period of time. And so it's important to kind of be aware for that in your races because there are going to be a lot of times where like you might make a setup for what you currently see, but the race may not be that way. In setups, I also do the same thing when I name my setups. If I have a setup that's like demonstrably fast in really wet conditions, which is terrible and dry, or other things like that, so that I'm aware of what I'm setting up for, so that it's just less likely to catch me out that all of a sudden, it dried up in the middle of the race and I had wet tires on or whatever the case may be. Okay, so talking about the wet line. This is kind of just a wet line 101 sort of thing. Compared to driving in real life, ACC gives you a ton of grip in the rain. So you really only notice like wet line differences when it first starts to rain and like the track's kind of like fast, greasy. But it's a good thing to just be mindful of conceptually, especially when you're driving with other cars. So in the dry, you've got a dry line, and we all know what that looks like. It gets really rubbered in, the track gets darker in places, we drive over it, we go faster, because sticky tires plus race rubber on the track equals fast lap time, right? Fantastic. In the rain, though, that gets flipped on its head, because rubber on rubber becomes very slippery, and so it makes it difficult to slow down, it makes it very, very difficult to turn. So what you end up doing with the wet line is it's just a minor variation of your traditional dry line. You're not shifting the corner too much. You're not changing the way you orient it a lot. But I put this diagram on the screen so you can get a sense of like your wet line is traditionally a little bit deeper into the corner. You're normally on the brakes a little bit earlier, and your turn in is maybe just a little bit. I will call it deeper into the corner because you're still apexing around or along the same point, but it's just the fact that you're turning on a place where your tires aren't on the rubber. Because any foot you go farther into the corner is a foot you have to come back, right? In the wet, the only difference here is that you're just trying to get off that rubber when you get the car turned. So you may be going a little bit deeper into the corner by just 6 inches a foot, 2 feet, depending on the type of track, right? And so you're not always going to stick to the same line all the time. You're not always going to end up doing the same thing every corner, every lap, because part of it is just sussing out where there is traction and using that to your best advantage. Your reference points in the wet aren't going to be dramatically different, really. Like, there's a little bit of common sense that you're kicking in where you're saying it's slippery and I'm moving at a decent amount of speed, so I need a little more room to slow down and move and turn, right? But, if you're braking if you're going to turn one and you're braking between the 100 and the 200 board I brake around like the 125, almost the 100 in the dry, I might start braking around the 150 in the wet, just to get myself a place to start. And if there are other cars around me, I might brake at the 160 because I don't know yet how the other cars in front of me are going to adapt to the rain. And I need more time to be able to let the car finish, like the cars in front of me, finish doing what they're doing before I try to like skirt by them or make a move or anything like that. Honestly, driving fast in the rain is really, really subjective, right? Like the rain's falling, the grip level's changing all the time. What will be fast 10 minutes from now is not going to be fast, now. You just need to kind of be in a general window of consistency where you can kind of stay, like the delta time here is your best friend. If you can stay within about a second to half a second in the rain, that's fantastically fast. Because you've got a lot of people falling off the road. You've got a lot of people outbraking themselves. You've got a bunch of changing conditions that happen. So it's very difficult to, just knock out a wet lap time over and over and over and over and over again. It's more about consistent feel and balance of the car so that you can just stay on the road. And that's 90% of the battle right there. If you're driving in the dry, you have to feed in your brake points. If you're driving in the wet, you have to feed in your brake points. You're just feeding in more brake point. You still have to be smooth. You still have to be smooth on the brakes. Like all of those things still apply, right? You just got a little less grip, and you've just got to get comfortable with the car moving around underneath you a little bit more. It's that comfort level that makes you fast in the wet more so than anything else. I could even give someone a crappy setup in the wet, and if they're comfortable, they'll be quicker than somebody who's not comfortable. Wet setups for ACC are actually pretty good as a place to start, right? Just get to a point where you can start to kind of get comfortable with the car, and then you can start making some adjustments. Quick wins, though, that are always going to help you is higher wing settings, because more downforce, you're going slower, you're going to have less grip, you want more aero balance in the car. Closing up your brake ducts for better tire heat management. Your rubber tires that are normally really hot from driving in the dry are being cooled down by rainwater. And so brake temperature is an amazing tool to manage tire temperature, especially because we need to keep the tire temperatures here higher, or the tire pressures here higher than we would in the dry. A wet tire pressure is typically between 29 and 31 psi. You can go a little bit over though in the rain because you've got water cooling you down. A wet tire is intentionally softer than a dry tire so that it can generate heat in a wet environment. So that's great when it's raining, right? It is awful when it's drying. It even will come to a point where if you're on a wet tire and can't do a pit stop, so like in these races, in these 30-minute sprint races, if it were to dry out in the middle, it'll be beneficial and faster to search for puddles in the track where you can cool your tires off and cool them off rather than just destroying them on a drying track. Right? So being aware of kind of what your tires are doing and how they're reacting is important. And also giving yourself a little bit of leeway on tire PSI wouldn't hurt you. So like for me, if I'm at 30.5, I'm pretty happy. Increasing ride heights to clear standing water and things on the track, but not by a dramatic amount. My current setup that I'm using, that stealing a line from Pope, is probably like a 7-toes setup. I've only raised the car about 4 mil. So it's not a lot, but it's enough so that like the front splitter isn't digging into any puddles. Even though I want to avoid curbs and things, it's enough that if I do touch a curb, it doesn't just bounce me over. It kind of rides me up. I can make some setup changes to dampers and other things to try to get the car to do a little bit more, but the reason why I didn't include them here is because your experience is going to vary, right? Like I said earlier, a driver who's more comfortable in a shitty setup in the rain will be a lot faster than a driver with a perfect setup that's not as comfortable. And I'll find way more time by just carrying momentum than I will in setup changes massively in the rain. Traction control is your friend, but to a point. So, for driving in the rain, I normally recommend folks stay within about 5 to 6. ABS is the same thing, right? Because in a dry scenario, the ABS is juddering to kind of help you, with your braking distances a little bit. And in the rain, too high of an ABS can work against you because you go to the brakes too suddenly and the ABS kicks in too soon. And so the brakes are just juddering all the time going in the corners, so not actually stopping you. So, I normally say 4 or 5 is probably a good place to start. And then, I'd rather folks adjust brake bias than adjust ABS, to be honest. Tire alignment, same thing. Like, I typically use my dry fast setup for tire alignment and then make changes to suit for the condition. So, like, I might run a little more caster in the wet because I want a heavier wheel in the wet, just a little. And I might run more camber if the track is going to stay wet. So you don't want to get stuck in this rabbit hole about driving in the wet that like you do 2 laps and you make a setup change, or you do 3 laps and you make a setup change. You want to do like 20 laps and then maybe make 1 change and then do like 20 more, because you'll find more time doing the 20 laps than you will doing 2. So I threw some setup slide on here because I wanted you guys to just be super aware of all the little things you should take a look at before you make sure you're driving in the rain. I know this is going to sound a little rudimentary, but like I make these mistakes all the time too. So if I make these mistakes, I'm going to assume you guys do too. First of all, it's like making sure you actually have your wet setup on your car when you go out to drive. So that's why I circled like the name of the setup up top. I just made sure to circle the setup thing to circle it. You know, the rudimentary school of thought is that the brake pads 3 or the 3 pads are your wet pad because they're not as aggressive and they don't bite as hard. And for a sprint race, that'll kind of work out okay. I've also read in other places that brake pads 2 will also work fine. But I typically run brake pads 3 in the wet. I just don't mess with it. And then also making sure you actually have the wet tire on. Because I've had it where I just didn't think about it, ran out, and I was on slicks in the rain and wonder what my car didn't want to turn. So, PSA. Check your setup before you drive. So some things that I talked to Marcus about that we wanted to make sure to bring up here. So one was making sure you had your web setup equipped. 2 is practice racing in different conditions. So, you know, Brian and I were talking about how in the league races we rarely like race in like thunderstorms or like terrible conditions, but it's still good to get some, you know, experience in heavy rain. It's definitely good to get some experience in light rain because light rain is kind of like that weird greasiness that's almost like a fast track on an early day. The other thing is if you can, try to practice with multiple cars on the track, either with AI or here like what you're doing today. And the reason for that is because, you know, with more cars on the track, we'll push more water off the track and we'll create dry lines, which will affect the tires dramatically differently. If you're more familiar with it and used to it, you'll kind of know where to manage. And also, you'll sometimes adapt different strategies to manage your tires for longer. I know I gave you guidance on traction control. I know I gave you guidance on a few other things. That's just guidance. It's not gospel. So if you have something that works better for your car, like, you know, somebody mentioned running pads 1, run pads 1. That's like, no, I'm not going to disqualify you from running different pads than me. Like, come on, right? Do what works best, but just be procedural in how you are making those changes so that you are sure that they're going to give you an added benefit. Don't trick yourself into thinking that a change is making a benefit because, you know, you've added a bunch of roll bar and you found a second when there's still 5 seconds left.